Hey guys, Buildzoid here, and today we're going to be taking a look at the Vega Frontier Edition PCB. And this thing packs the most powerful Vcore VRM I have ever seen on a reference card. So we'll just start right off with that.
Before that, this coverage is brought to you by the Core G21 enclosure from Thermaltake, a $70 case with two 4mm thick tempered glass side panels, meshed ventilation in the front for breathability, a rarity in cases these days, and a power supply shroud with top-mounted SSD sleds. Learn more at the link in the description below.
The Vcore monstrosity is this giant L-shaped block around the core. And this L shape is actually, like, it looks really weird because we've never seen, as far as I know, I've never seen this on another card, but this actually is the optimum VRM layout for any scenario. Obviously, it isn't very popular on GPUs because generally you don't want your GPU being, really, really tall. But the reason why this is the optimal layout, and why AMD used it, is basically the distance from any of your actual phases to the GPU core, because that's what it's powering. This brick right here, that's the GPU core. These two down here are the HBM stacks. But this VRM is pumping current into this block right here, and so the closer it can be to that, the less voltage drop you suffer, which ever so slightly improves your efficiency, and it also slightly improves voltage regulation because you have less propagation delay from basically the core to the VRM. So this does have benefits. They are very, very minor, though. That's why, that's like, it doesn't matter a ton. Really, you sort of hit diminishing returns on like high-end cards where they have the massive power planes going through the PCB anyway. Where this would be more like where you'd really start seeing a difference is when you have VRM layouts which are really unoptimal, right? Like this might be the optimal layout, but the difference between this and something less than ideal is not that bad. Well, less than this is not that bad. The difference between, well, cards where you'll see this actually be a major problem is dual GPU cards, because you basically end up in a situation where having massive power planes is just not an option because you need to fit so much stuff on those cards that you actually see voltage drop from the VRM to the GPU core, as high as 50 to even 100 millivolts under load, which is crazy. So like your VRM will be putting out 1.3 volts. By the time it hits the GPU core, you're only getting 1.2. Here, you'll basically have, like, this phase right here would sit at 1.2, and by the time it gets to the GPU core, you'd be at, like, 1.19. Oh, wait, oops. One too many ones. But you'd be at, like, 1.19 volts. So, this is definitely, like, the perfect layout for a VRM, but it won't really, like, it's cool that that AMD opted for it. It's cool that it's possible thanks to the HBM. Ultimately, it won't probably matter that much, but I did feel like pointing it out. Since it does explain why AMD actually sort of went for this L shape, because, it's like, why wouldn't they just use all of this empty space over here? Well, they put the fan over there. And this layout is actually just straight up better than trying to put, than trying to cram a 16-phase VRM into this area. So, yeah, that's kind of cool. Now let's talk actual details on this VRM, why it's so powerful. The funky layout obviously doesn't mean it's capable. It's a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 phase VRM design. So naturally, it's obviously running a doubling scheme, as you can't buy a 12-phase voltage controller, which we'll need to go on the back of the card to check that out. The voltage controller is this chip right over here, and that is a IR 35217. I currently do not have a datasheet for this thing, as it seems to be so new that you can't look it up. I don't think it's a rebrand or anything. It is from the IR 35200 series, but yeah, I can't get a datasheet for it right now. So there is a 35201, 211, there's a 201, there's also, there's a bunch of other 35200 series chips. I'm assuming this is going to be just another one of those 30, this has to be a 6-phase voltage controller just because we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. These are IR, oops, that's a B. IR3598s. But nonetheless, this is just, it's going to be a 6 plus something voltage controller, because it also controls the HBM VRM down here, which we have one driver IC right there. But this is a 35200 series chip, so it should do the usual 200 kilohertz to 2 megahertz switching frequency range. Not that the upper limits of that switching frequency range really aren't useful. Even here with the doubling scheme, you could actually go all the way up to 2 megahertz without having this VRM catch on fire for you. But the problem is, as you really push the switching frequency on VRMs, their efficiency just goes down the drain. Most MOSFETs are basically not designed to function above 1 megahertz anyway. The ones used on this card, they will function above 1 megahertz switching frequency. The IR3598s can actually push more than 1 megahertz switching frequency output. So you can push 2 megahertz into them. But the problem is, your efficiency is just going to be really, really bad. So really that upper limit does not matter. Though pushing this up to, say, 1 megahertz switching frequency might see some benefit, but with this being a 12-phase, and with the decoupling job that AMD does on these high-end HBM cards, I mean, this is ceramic capacitor city. This is more like just ridiculous amount of decoupling capacitors right there. And then we have high-end, these are SMD polymers. These things are literally the best option for VRM capacitors, and these are 470 microfarad. So the chances of this VRM needing more phases just to get stable voltage regulation, very, very low. When I get my card, I'm gonna still try attach even more capacitors to it, but I really doubt I will see any benefits. AMD is generally really, really good about getting ridiculously stable voltage regulation on their reference cards, and this, just looking at the design we have here, the IR voltage controller, which incidentally this thing is digital, so it will support software voltage control, and then the IR3598 doublers, these are they don't have any advanced features, but they do interleave your 2 phases, so this does run cleaner than a native 6-phase, and the 6-phase on the Fury X was excellent, and it was smaller. So this is even a step up from the Fury X VRM. It's pretty much double what the Fury X came with. So voltage regulation-wise, nothing to worry about. Really, it doesn't get better. This is very much like this VRM in terms of control scheme, excluding the fact that this uses a different voltage controller, is exactly the same as what you would find on a 290X Lightning for the Vcore. So I can't find any complaints to have about the control scheme, except, maybe they could have gone for a 16-phase, but that would kind of get really excessive. That phase count is really rare for a reason. It's generally pretty impractical. So back on the front of the PCB, let's talk actual power capabilities. So the control of the VRM is good. There's nothing to complain about there. Now, the actual power capabilities, each phase has a single low-side MOSFET and a single high-side MOSFET. The low-side FET is AMD's favorite IRF 6894. This is a international rectifier direct FET. It is really easy to recognize these because they have the metal casing. This helps with thermal dissipation as well as basically it's mostly a thermal dissipation thing. These things are not cheap, actually. They come in well over... off the top of my head, they're around 1.2 euros per 1,000, according to International Rectifier's own website. Now, the high side MOSFET is the usual IRF, just because if you have a 6894, this one always goes with it. It's a 6811, and that is also a direct FET, much smaller though, and worse thermal handling capabilities. But nonetheless, this combination of MOSFETs, this is the same you would find on a 290X Lightning. And with this set of MOSFETs in each phase, this VRM, assuming in operating conditions of 1.2 volts output, 12 volts input, obviously, it's powered by an ATX PSU, 300 kilohertz switching frequency, and 5 volts gate drive, which the 5 volts gate drive is very, very unlikely on this card. It might even be using 12 volts gate drive. I am not sure. These MOSFETs can certainly run on 12 volts, However, the thing is, 5 volts gate drive is the minimum operating voltage for these MOSFETs. Well, really it's 4.5, but 4.5 volts to 5 volts, it's the same thing. So I'm using the 5 volts gate drive voltage because without the card in hand, I can't check what the actual gate drive voltage is, and this will give you the worst current handling capability figures for this VRM. 300 kilohertz switching frequency on the actual phases themselves. I'm assuming, based off of the fact that AMD's past cards were running 300 kilohertz switching frequencies, so that would be 600 kilohertz on the controller. There's a pretty good chance that the actual phase switching frequency is even lower than what I'm using here, so I feel pretty safe in saying that any current figures I list, as well as heat outputs, are worst case scenario. Certainly they're not going to be driving the MOSFETs with 5 volts. That's no AMD card ever has driven with 5 volts. They usually drive with 7 or 10. So, you know. Let's get into the current figures. So 200 amps, which I don't think the card will actually run on 200 amps just because we're looking at a 300 watt TDP and HBM does not use a lot of power, nor do any of the other systems on the card. 200 amps, we're going to be looking at around 23 watts of heat output, and on the MOSFETs, not inductors and capacitors included. Just the MOSFETs will put out about 23 watts of heat output. So that's a thing. Then 300 amps, you're looking at 43 watts of heat output. Now this, I would say, is slightly above what the card will normally use, unless the card spends most of its time sitting at around 1 volt. I haven't yet gotten my card. I can't do checks on how the card runs under typical loading. I generally, when I do these analyses, I like to run with numbers from cards with no power limit, because then they don't change their voltage on the fly, making it really easy to predict how they'll behave when you really, really crank up the voltage, instead of trying to figure out what the actual peak current draw because basically if the card is power throttling, right, it'll drop the voltage, it'll drop the clock, but your current will still be up, which is why it's still bouncing off the power limit. And then if the current drops down, it'll pull up the voltage and it'll pull up the clock because you're pulling less current, but effectively your power draw is still the same. But if I kept the voltage high and I didn't drop the clocks, because the power limit was lifted, then your current would generally just shoot through the roof. So I'm not currently sure how much power you would need for overclocking, because overclocking, you're obviously going to do everything in your power to reduce any kind of power-based throttling or temperature-based throttling. And so, as of right now, I don't have data on how much power this VRM will actually have to handle when overclocked. Certainly for stock power consumption, this thing is ridiculous overkill. Well, let's keep going up the current figures. So 400 amps, this VRM will put out 66 watts of heat. That is starting to get into the problematic area. This VRM is pretty spread out, as you can clearly see. Good amount of surface area on it. So it's going to be, you know, it's not going to be the hardest thing ever to cool, but 66 watts of heat is a good amount. Like, that's a lot of heat. So, you know, if you're hammering this card, VRM temperatures are going to be, you should keep an eye on them. However, the MOSFETs themselves can actually do 400 amps of current, even at temperatures as high as 138 degrees centigrade. So everything else on the VRM will complain at that point. Your capacitors capacitors generally don't come in ratings above 105. Some of them come at 125 degrees rating, but those are really, really rare. And 125 degrees is still less than 138. So the MOSFETs won't die if you run them really, really hot. Everything else on the VRM will, however, suffer significantly reduced lifespans. So, yeah, you know, short-term operation at very high current loads, possible, not recommended. Depends really on your VRM cooling. The VRM can go higher. 500 amps, you're going to be looking at about 92 watts of heat output. And it can still go further, as I'm assuming that, this is assuming you can keep the VRM at 125 degrees, as MOSFETs do. Basically, as long as you're not hitting the thermal junction max of the MOSFETs, you can keep pushing more current. Once they exceed thermal junction max, they'll thermal run away and blow themselves to pieces. But if you can keep the VRM at 125 degrees, even with the 92 watt heat output, then 500 amps, you can totally push that through it as well. In fact, you can go all the way up to 700 amps. However, at that point, it'll put out the same amount of power as a GPU. So, this is basically, it'll handle it in short-term bursts. The heat output at those kinds of current levels is so high, you're not going to be able to cool it. However, the good news is basically that this VRM right here is certainly very, very capable. In fact, the MOSFET selection, the driving setup, and everything but the voltage controller here, and the inductors and the capacitor selection, is the same as what you would find on a 290X Lightning. So power-wise, this VRM is on par with high-end custom GPUs of a few years ago. So, yeah, it is by far the most powerful VRM we've ever seen, like, ever on a reference card. This makes the GTX 480's VRM look like a bad joke, and the GTX 480 would be the only card I can think of that should be in the same kind of current levels, because the GTX 480 came at extremely low stock voltage due to its ridiculous power draw. But yeah, this VRM is just like, it's a thing of beauty. But the side effect is, that leaves the question of, does this card really need 12 phases, or is AMD just being very generous? You know, if we judge based on the RX 480, where the VRM was ridiculous overkill on the reference card. Like, it wasn't exactly power efficient. The MOSFETs really weren't the best for power efficiency, but they were very, very capable MOSFETs. That card had a VRM capable of delivering 2 to 3 times its stock power draw. Stock current consumption. And what we're looking at here is, you know, it's a really nice VRM. The question is, does the card pull so much power at stock that this is actually necessary, or is AMD just doing what they did on the 480, where the stock VRM was like, you could take a 480 and max, like a reference 480, and max it out on liquid nitrogen, and the VRM would not be the problem you'd run into. So that is the question I'm still left wondering, is just like, I mean, on one hand, AMD does have a history of putting really nice VRM designs on their cards. Even the Fury X, it's like 1.4 volts. VRM handles it, no problem. Even the cooler on the Fury X will actually deal with 1.4 volts and more. I've just not been brave enough to go higher yet. But yeah, it's just, this is literally twice the Fury X's VRM. So does it run twice as much power at stock as a Fury X? I mean, twice as much current at stock? Or, you know, I mean, it is a $1,000 card, so maybe AMD just went the extra step and actually gave us a VRM that's worth a damn. But kind of concerning, and leaves a lot of questions to still answer, at least for me. Now then, let's move on to the minor VRMs, and when I say minor, I mean less than 1/12 of what the main VRM is. This right here is the HBM VRM. It is a significant downgrade compared to the Vcore VRM. It's a single phase, we just have one choke here, and that powers both of the memory stacks, and it uses a on-semiconductor dual NFET. This thing is nothing amazing. It's a 4C86N. That's not the full model number, but if you put that into Google, it'll find it, or into On Semiconductor's website, it'll find it. So that's a dual NFET, so basically the high-side MOSFET and the low-side MOSFET are integrated into the chip. This thing is not that great. The end result is that this VRM can do 10 amps at about 2 watts of heat output on the MOSFET, 20 amps at about 4 watts of heat output, which incidentally, assuming I'm assuming these operating specs for that MOSFET down here, and the reason I'm assuming that 1.2 volts, not a higher voltage, is because HBM, at least by SK Hynix spec, is meant to run on 1.2 volts. Now, in the past, on the Fury X, AMD was running 1.3 volts through the HBM, but without a card in hand to check, I have no idea what they're actually running it on. I'm going to assume that this time around, the HBM2 is actually working properly. I hope. I really, really hope that at this point, they can run the freaking memory at spec voltage instead of over voltage, just to hit the stock frequency that it's supposed to do. And I'm assuming they're going to run 1.2 volts, 300 kilohertz, 5 volts gate drive again. So assuming those settings, this 20 amp figure, 4 watts heat output is actually 85% efficiency, which is just cool because it confirms for me that my VRM calculation matches exactly the calculation that they have on the data sheet. Well, more or less exactly. It's about 85% for both my calculator and the data sheet. So 20 amps, 4 watts, and then 30 amps you're looking at 7 watts. Now, I'm not going to go into any higher current figures because really the HBM on stock voltage should only be pulling between 10 and 20 amps. I think around 15, maybe 17 amps on stock settings. So it really doesn't need a lot of power. And that's why we're looking at such a really small VRM, like such a small VRM for it. Now then, moving on to the remaining minor rails, we have these 3 guys over here, and these are 3 different voltages. I don't know which one is which. I'm not sure how much any of these voltages pull. The data sheet for these MOSFETs is horrifically useless in that it only gives me ambient temperature, ambient air thermal resistance, which is useless for a GPU with a heatsink on the VRM. That's the main problem. It's like that 125C figure right here, that's MOSFET. Like if you put a thermocouple on top of the MOSFET, if that's the temperature of the MOSFET, then this is how much current you can push through it before it starts to go, thermal runaway on you. Obviously, if the temperature goes up by 1 degree, then you've just exceeded your current limit, and bam, it goes thermal runaway on you anyway. But if you put a thermocouple on there, this is the temperature that you'll measure, and these are the current levels it'll do, assuming you can keep it at that temperature. The problem is, I don't have the thermal resistance figure for these for case temperature, so basically you put a thermocouple on these, and I can't tell you anything about what they should handle. Ambient air temperature figures, like, I don't know what kind of actual operating temperature the MOSFETs will hit. But it looks like from the data sheet, any of these should be able to handle about 10 amps. These are all dual NFETs again, and the voltages they're producing are going to be VDDCI, so that's the memory controller on the AMD GPUs, which if you notice, compared to GDDR5 AMD GPUs, the VDDCI VRM being one of these 3 is actually a huge difference, because VDDCI on, say, something like a RX 480 is actually very similar to this. So it's about twice to 3 times as powerful as what you're getting right here for VDDCI, because the big difference with HBM, you don't save that much power on the HBM's own voltage. It's not that different from GDDR5. Where there is a huge difference is the memory controller. The memory controller for HBM is way, way, way more power efficient, and the end result is that we have a really, really pathetic little VDDCI VRM, as well as, well, it's not pathetic, it's just, reasonably sized now. So you have a much smaller VDDCI VRM compared to what you would see on a lot of other cards. Now, the other voltage these will be doing is VPP, so this is a supporting voltage for the HBM. GDDR5X also has a VPP rail. Basically, this is a voltage that used to be internal to GDDR5, DDR3, and all of that. While DDR4, GDDR5X, I imagine whatever comes after GDDR5X, HBM, HBM2, all of these have an external VPP, and this was done because it improves memory power efficiency. It used to be that the voltage would be created inside the actual memory chips themselves. Here it's made external because this is the more power efficient way to generate it. And then finally, the third one of these will be the display drive voltage, which I don't have a nice shortcut for, so I'm just going to call it DISP. And that's basically, that powers some of the GPU's internal PLLs as well as the display outputs. This voltage is very, very useful when pushing AMD cards on liquid nitrogen, because AMD cards on liquid nitrogen have a tendency to lose their display outputs, as in your monitor will just go black. The card's still running, the display outputs just drop out, and this happens specifically under load when pushing very high core voltages at very low temperatures. The display just stops working for whatever reason, and you can fix it by bumping up the display output voltage. As that circuitry either gets too cold or power starved or something happens to it and it starts complaining. So, yeah. But none of these voltages are, well, I think Wattman may or may not have VDDCI voltage control currently available. VPP and VDISP, this one basically does nothing for overclocking. This one's only relevant on liquid nitrogen. Neither of those is going to be available in software. So you don't have to worry about those, really. And, yeah. So that covers all the VRMs. Vcore VRM could not, lovely. I love it. It could not be, it could be even bigger, But at that point, I'd really start questioning, like, is AMD just, like, gonna start making extreme overclocking cards out of the box, making all the non-reference designs completely pointless? Or even worse, because that's actually happened, is like AMD's reference 7970 PCB was just so nice and expensive, I guess, that there was 7970s with downgraded PCBs. In fact, there's RX 480s with downgraded PCBs. So, you know, it's like, at some, like on NVIDIA side, it's like, oh yeah, we don't want the reference card, it's awful. On AMD's side, it's like, sometimes the reference card is actually the best. And, you know, that's kind of starting to get ridiculous. So Vcore VRM, I really, like, I have no complaints about what I'm seeing so far. I'm just hoping that it's not indicative of some ridiculous stock current consumption. The HBM VRM, it is a single phase, and I will complain about that, because I'd like to see a two-phase. It's just the HBM on the Fury X, I know that ran stock HBM overvolted, and it was just like, you know, generally a mess. But that card benefits from extra capacitors on the HBM VRM, which basically tells you it should have had an extra phase because the voltage isn't stable enough on a single phase. But here we do have a single phase, and it really depends. I'm gonna go and test if, you know, I'm gonna obviously test if this single phase is enough. I'm hoping it is, but judging from the Fury X, it might not be. So just gonna throw that out there. And then the minor ones, it's like, you can't control VPP. I don't care about, even as an extreme overclocker. I just don't care. VDDCI really shouldn't pull enough power to be concerning, and VDISP never does. That one has been a 10 amp, basically 10 amp, fully integrated buck converter chip for ages and ages and ages, and it's never actually pulled the 10 amps, and it's basically completely irrelevant for everything except liquid nitrogen overclocking. So VRM wise, this card is fine. Now let's look at some of the cool features that this also comes with. This right here is a dual BIOS switch, which is standard for all high-end AMD reference cards. You'd find this on a 7970. I think even my 5870 doesn't have it, but 6970, yeah, 6970s had it. 7970s had it. 290Xs had it. Fury Xs have it. Vega now has it. So, you know, bring that on. I love BIOS modding, and the BIOS switch is really nice. I just hope there's not going to be any more BIOS signature checks in the driver, because those always just, you know, rain on your parade. But it is nice that you at least get dual BIOS. There's one BIOS chip right here. There's another one on the back of the card. Right on the, basically mirrored with the BIOS chip on the front, except tweaked by a little bit on the angle. And then the last cool feature this has is the GPU tachometer right here, which is basically a strip of LEDs. I think it's really cool. A lot of people think it's useless fluff like all the other RGB we see these days, but this is actually useful because this delivers, you know, it's not system critical information like voltage or temperature, but it's really useful for debug, like figuring out what's wrong with like a crossfire setup. Because it will show you if ULPS is enabled, it will show you if the cards aren't being loaded up properly, and that's about it, really. It'll pretty much tell you, it's like, are the cards running the way they should be, because this does indicate GPU load. So very nice for, you know, if you're running, if you're doing what I do, this comes in handy every so often, which is a lot better than most of the RGB stuff where it's like, oh, like, yeah, it looks nice. And also the cool thing is, which a lot of people on the Fury cards weren't aware of, there's a little switch right here. This is a 2-channel dip switch. You can change the color. On the Fury X's, this was red and blue. I assume it's red and blue again. I would hope that it would have been blue and yellow, because the card is blue and yellow, and that would be color coordinated, but I'm gonna just guess that it's blue and red anyway. But you can change the color of the LEDs, and you can completely turn them off using that switch. So that's it for this video. You know, I hope you found it informative. You can leave a comment down below if you have any thoughts or questions to share. You can like the video if you liked it, dislike it if you disliked it. Please consider donating to the Gamers Nexus Patreon if you would like to see us do, you know, if you would like to support what we do here. If you would like to see more content like this and more overclocking videos, then I have a channel called Actually Hardcore Overclocking. You can go watch all kinds of hardcore overclocking related stuff like liquid nitrogen overclocking and that kind of thing over there. That's it for this video. Thank you for watching and see you next time.